Hello, it is Mr. Blake again, and today, or in this video, I'm going to talk about the role that energy plays in the development of countries. And so, I guess, the first thing that we need to really kind of discuss is the concept of supply and demand, which means that the more supply there is of something, the value of that is going to go down. If there's more demand for it than supply, then the price tends to go up. And so when we're looking at basic raw materials, this often impacts developing countries quite a bit. And specifically, I'm going to talk about energy production today. When we're looking at the consumers of energy and the suppliers of energy, one of the things that'll stand out if you look at some of the maps that you might see in the development section is the consumers of energy are just a handful of countries. Us, the West Europeans, to a lesser extent, the Chinese, Japan, and places like that are big consumers of global energy sources. And if you think about that, it kind of makes sense. If you go home and look at all the things that we have in post-industrial societies like ours or Canada or Japan or wherever, look at all the electronic devices that we have that consume electric power, the presence of cars on our roads, the number of trains that we might have. All of these things consume energy. And that's excluding even the industries and things like that that are also consuming vast amounts of energy. And so what we see is the more developed countries tend to consume the most amount of the world's energy. And so then we have to ask ourselves, well, where all is that energy coming from? And if you break it down into types of energy, you're going to be looking at your fossil fuels, your coals, your oil, your natural gas. We have a lot of reserves of that sort of stuff. We've got oil, we've got natural gas, we've got lots of coal. And so we as Americans will tend to use those sources of energy because they have them available. Russia is a major exporter of oil and natural gas. The Middle East, if you think about Saudi Arabia and Iran and Iraq and Kuwait and the United Arab Emirates and places like that, which are very oil and natural gas rich, that is actually where most of these countries are actually making all their money, is selling this as a raw material. And there are other places too, Venezuela, Nigeria, the Gabon, in places like Africa, for instance, will have oil reserves and they will either consume it locally in their own industries or transportation, or they will export it to other countries around the world. The big thing to understand about our energy sources, if we're looking at like fossil fuels, is that it is not evenly distributed around the world. Not every country has access to oil, natural gas, and coal, let's say. And so those are going to be countries that are going to be dependent on somebody else providing them with an energy source. And if you're a developing country, that can sometimes be a big problem, especially if those fuels are becoming very expensive in the supply and demand, that you may not be able to afford the oil that you need for your economy. So that's one of those things you have to take into consideration when you're looking at the developmental levels of different countries. There are other sources of energy out there. There is nuclear, for instance, but then you're also looking at where is the raw material for that, and that would be things like uranium. There's only a few places in the world where you can mine uranium, and so those countries have access to it, and many other countries do not, as an energy source. And when we talk about energy sources, we probably should divide them up into renewables, non-renewables, and inexhaustibles. You are probably familiar with the renewables and non-renewables. Non-renewables are things like our fossil fuels, uranium, things like that, where there's a finite amount of it in the world. And then when we burn through all of that, literally, we're not going to have any more of that. And so we're not producing more of it. Renewables are things like firewood. If you think about the developing world, many people are still dependent on using wood as a fuel. for cooking or heating their home or whatever. And you can run out of that as well if you don't manage it properly. If you cut down all the trees, you don't have any more trees. And so you have to go through forest management to keep enough trees still available that you can still harvest some of them and use them for firewood or whatever. But you are still going to replant those to replace those and still have trees in existence so that next year you can harvest some more and replant that area and then cut down another part next year and the following year and replant that. And the idea is that there should be a cycle to where you don't chew through your entire supply of that particular resource, in this case, wood. That would be considered a renewable, that we could make more of that if we do it properly. The inexhaustibles are things like solar, hydroelectric, geothermal, all of these things that so long as the earth is spinning and the sun exists, will probably be available as an energy source. It doesn't really matter what the humans do or not. And so in these cases, we can continue to build windmills. We can continue to drill for geothermal energy from the crust of the earth. We can build the tidal generators that use the tides of the oceans to generate electricity. We can do all of these things, and it becomes a source of power. Now, you have to have the technology to do it. Which means that in many cases, the countries that are doing this are the post-industrial countries. Some of the industrialized countries are doing this as well, because this is going to be a reliable, sustainable source of power for the future. Coal and oil and natural gas are not sustainable since they are, by their definition, finite. They're not renewable. And so you can't have an economic system that is sustainable over the long haul, building it on those types of energy sources. There's also the look at new technologies like fusion generation, which has been the realm of science fiction for 100 years or so. The idea of fusing molecules and atoms together to create this energy source, which theoretically you could do as an inexhaustible sort of thing. That has always been as I said, the realm of science fiction, but within the last year or so, there are scientists starting to work and build a reactor to do this sort of thing. So maybe that's going to be one of our new energy sources of the future. Speaking of our energy sources, as you are probably aware, the United States, amongst the other developed countries, is a big importer of petroleum and things like natural gas. Petroleum in particular is very useful because it's not only just a fuel, but you can also make plastics out of it as well. And there are a group of countries out there that control much of the oil production that is done around the world. That's the OPEC cartel. A cartel is a group of somebodies that get together and are going to work together to control the production, of the distribution, and the price of a particular thing. Now, you probably are aware of it being sort of drug cartels, and frankly speaking, drug cartels do exactly what the OPEC nations do. They try to control production, distribution, and price. But in the case of OPEC, we're dealing with oil. These are countries like Saudi Arabia, Iran, the Emirates, Kuwait, Iraq, Venezuela is a member, Nigeria is a member. So if you're a country that exports a lot of oil, there's a pretty good chance that you are a member of this particular group. And what they do is they control the price of oil by controlling the supply and the demand. If the price of oil is going too low and they're not making any money off of it anymore, then they will start cutting back on the amount of oil they produce, and that's going to drive the price back up. If it starts getting too expensive, now that means, yeah, great, they're making lots of money, but at a certain point, we, like the American consumer, will quit buying so much gas, or heaven forbid, we decide to turn in our old gas guzzling cars and suddenly are all driving Teslas or something, electric cars, which means they're not selling us gasoline anymore. So they don't want that to happen either. They want to keep the price within a particular range that we're willing to pay in order to buy gasoline at a particular price. And that's the whole idea behind OPEC, is to keep the price within that range so that they won't go running off and buying electric cars, but they're still making a lot of money off of it by controlling the price and the amount of oil that's out in the market for them to sell. And also dealing with oil, but this also applies to things like coal and natural gas and some of the other energy sources as well, is the difference between proven and potential reserves of something. When we talk about reserves, that means it's probably still in the ground somewhere. And if we have proven reserves, that means that we have scientific evidence that this field of oil exists underneath the surface. It's going to have X amount of millions or billions of barrels of oil that's down there, or however many trillion cubic feet of natural gas, whatever it is, that we have tested it, we know it's there, and we are probably already extracting it from the ground. Those are your proven reserves. If you hear about potential reserves, that means that we believe that it probably exists down there somewhere, that we may have some evidence that it exists, but we don't know exactly how much, and often as not, we don't know if we can actually get to it. So anytime you're listening to the news and they talk about a new field of oil that's been discovered in Freestan or whatever, always listen carefully. Is it a proven reserve or is it a potential reserve? Because proven means we know it's there. It's time to start sucking it out of the ground. If it is potential, that means we're not really sure it's there. It could be there. And so you always have to be careful with those kinds of news stories. Other things that we may make energy out of would be like things like biomass, that we can take carbon, stuff our own garbage and turn it into energy. That it seems to be one of the growing things that we might be doing in the future. Another thing to think about is solar. You're probably more familiar with what we call active solar. Active solar is like the solar panels you see on the top of buildings and people's houses and stuff. And what they're doing is they're collecting that solar radiation and heating up either metal or water in those photovoltaic cells. And that is what they use to begin to generate electricity. And that electricity you're using either directly or you're using it to power up batteries. So that's active solar. Passive solar, you have experienced if you've ever been to like the shopping mall or somewhere where there's a big asphalt parking lot and it's July in Texas. And so when you get out of the car, you feel like you're melting because you're getting solar radiation off the sun, but you're also getting all that heat radiation coming off the asphalt. The asphalt has been absorbing solar radiation and it's turning it into heat. And that's called passive solar, that you're not going through some sort of process to collect it. You're turning it into some sort of heat source, and it radiates out from there. Best example I can think of here is your house. If you live up in the northern states, let's say you're from Ohio or something, it's going to matter a great deal which way your house faces. Because you can put in big windows on the east-west side of your house. You want the front of your house kind of facing south. Because if you can put in those big old giant windows, that means that you can pick up solar radiation as the sun comes up, and you can pick up solar radiation as the sun goes down in the west. And that will help actually heat your house. That solar radiation can go through the glass windows, and that heat's then trapped inside your house, and it helps heat your house. So that would be a passive solar heating system, is just using like giant windows and stuff to do it. Now, if you're using solar cells, photovoltaic cells, you're doing active solar. And I hope that makes some sense. So here is around the world how we deal with energy, both as developing countries and developed. And I hope you enjoyed my today's TED Talk about energy.